Hey guys, most people picture medieval hunger as a simple matter of not having enough food, as though peasants merely lived with smaller meals and longer winters. But for much of medieval Europe, hunger was not just the absence of food. It was a rhythm, a pressure, a calculation, and sometimes a quiet companion that followed people through entire seasons of their lives. And before we settle in, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what piece of history you'd like to hear about next. If you enjoy this kind of thoughtful long-form history, a like is a simple way to support the channel. And if calm, quietly fascinating history is your kind of thing, subscribe for more. Now, to understand what hunger was really like for medieval peasants, it helps to begin by setting aside a modern assumption. Hunger in the medieval world was not always dramatic. It did not always arrive as a famine, a corpse in the road, or a village emptied of life. More often, it appeared in slower and more ordinary forms. It lived in thin pottage, in bread stretched with inferior grains, in the careful saving of cheese, in the anxious glance at a poor harvest, in the knowledge that the hungry season had not yet reached its worst point. What people feared was not only starvation, though that fear was real enough. It was the long wearing down of the body by insufficiency, the erosion of strength, the uncertainty of whether next month would be leaner than this one. For a medieval peasant household, food was not simply purchased and consumed. It was bound up with weather, labor, land rights, rents, custom, storage, fuel, animals, tools, and time. A family might work hard in a world that looked green and fertile, yet still remain precariously close to want. That is one of the first realities modern viewers often miss. Medieval peasants were not hungry because they were lazy, disorganized, or ignorant of farming. They were hungry because even skill and effort could only do so much inside a system with narrow margins and repeated risks. A good harvest could bring relief, but relief was not the same as plenty. Even in reasonably stable years, many peasant diets were monotonous and limited. Bread in one form or another was central. Pottage, a kind of thick stew or porridge that could absorb whatever ingredients were available, was equally important. Ale, often weaker than modern beer, helped provide calories and safer liquid than doubtful water sources in some settings. There might be beans, peas, onions, cabbage, leeks, perhaps a little dairy, perhaps eggs when available, and sometimes small amounts of bacon or lard to flavor a dish rather than transform it into a feast. Meat, despite the popular image of a hearty pre-modern table, was often irregular for ordinary rural households. Even where peasants kept animals, those animals were not always there to be eaten at convenience. A cow meant milk, traction, manure, and future value. A pig might represent stored wealth. Chickens produced eggs. To consume an animal too casually could be to consume tomorrow. So hunger often meant living in a body that had enough to continue, but not always enough to flourish. It meant work performed on fuel that was sometimes insufficient for the effort required. And peasant labor was rarely light. Agricultural life demanded long hours at the most physically important moments of the year. Plowing, sowing, reaping, threshing, carrying, cutting, digging, mending, hauling water, gathering fuel, tending animals, repairing structures, processing grain, and countless domestic tasks filled the calendar. Hunger under such conditions was not abstract. It was felt in the limbs. It altered speed, patience, sleep, and illness. A person could wake already tired. One of the most revealing features of medieval peasant life is that the most dangerous point in the year was often not winter, at least not in the simple story we tend to imagine. Winter was harsh, of course, and cold increased hardship, but the truly anxious stretch in many farming communities came in late spring and early summer, what historians sometimes describe as the lean months. By then, the previous harvest stores might be running low, and the new crops were not yet ready. Grain bins had been opened and reopened for months. Salted provisions had shrunk. Cheese had been eaten. Seed had to be protected, not treated as spare food. The landscape might look alive again, but the table could be at its weakest. This created a bitter irony. The world was warming, the fields were visibly returning, and yet people could be hungriest when nature seemed to be recovering. That seasonal contradiction shaped the emotional life of peasant communities more than it is often given credit for. Hunger had a calendar. People knew the dangerous weeks before they arrived. They could feel them approaching in the rate at which stores declined, in the cautious thinning of meals, in the small decisions made at the pot and the hearth. A household did not need to be in full famine to experience dread. And dread mattered, because food in the medieval village was not merely nourishment. It was security made visible. A full granary was not comfort in the modern sense. It was survival, bargaining power, and emotional steadiness. When grain stores were sound, a family could breathe more easily. When they were low, every problem sharpened. An injury became more threatening. A sick child became more frightening. A wet spell or local blight became harder to absorb. Hunger made all other difficulties feel closer. Even the bread itself could tell the story of a year. In better conditions, grain quality was higher and the flour cleaner. In worse years, bread might be stretched with coarser grains, with legumes, or in truly desperate circumstances with fillers that reflected distress more than preference. The further food drifted from the ideal, the more clearly hunger could be tasted before it was openly named. Medieval people were highly aware of such distinctions. They knew the feel of good bread, the weight of a loaf, the satisfaction of a fuller pot, the embarrassment of serving poorer fare, the bodily truth of being less well-fed than one ought to be. This is another place where a modern listener may notice something important. Hunger was social as well as physical. Not everyone in the medieval world endured it in the same way, and peasants knew that. Lords, monasteries, urban elites, and royal households did not eat like the people who worked the land. Even within rural society, differences mattered. Some peasants held more land, more animals, better rights, or more stable access to common resources. Others had smaller plots, heavier obligations, worse luck, or more mouths to feed. So hunger was not just a condition of nature. It could also feel like a condition of inequality. If a peasant owed rents, dues, labor services, or a portion of produce, those obligations did not always soften just because a household was strained. Medieval institutions could sometimes provide relief, but they could also intensify pressure. Grain might leave a village in taxes or rents even when local people felt the shortage keenly. A family could work land and still watch a share of its output move beyond its table. That did not always produce open rebellion, but it shaped how hunger was understood. It was not only bad weather that made bellies empty, it was structure. And yet structure alone does not tell the whole story. Medieval peasants were not passive victims drifting helplessly through each year. They were observant managers of scarcity. They stored, dried, salted, gathered, gleaned, borrowed, bartered, stretched, substituted, and planned as carefully as their circumstances allowed. Women especially, though the work was shared in different ways by household and region, were central to this daily management of food. To make survival possible meant not only producing food but transforming limited ingredients into sustaining meals, deciding what could be saved, what must be eaten now, and what risk could not be taken. Hunger was fought not only in the field but in the home. The domestic side of medieval survival is easy to overlook because it appears humble. It does not announce itself like a battle or a coronation, but a household's ability to endure depended on mundane skills of astonishing importance. How long grain lasted in storage, how carefully it was milled, how evenly meals were portioned, how scraps were reused, how gardens were managed, how much fuel remained for cooking, whether a child could be fed first, whether a sick adult was given more or less. Whether seed was touched in desperation, these were not minor questions. They were the daily politics of survival. To feel medieval hunger properly, then, is to imagine not merely a single missed meal, but a world in which food insecurity sat inside decision-making all the time. A person might not say every day that they were starving, but they might know every day exactly how much remained. They might measure life in loaves, in sacks, in handfuls, in the depth left at the bottom of a barrel. Hunger often began as awareness. Children would have learned this awareness early. They might not have understood rents or harvest yields in formal terms, but they understood when meals became thinner, when adults were tense, when bread was smaller, when no extra was offered, when the household spoke more often of waiting. Elderly people, too, were vulnerable in such systems, especially when dependent on family support or limited means. Hunger was unevenly distributed within households, sometimes softened by care, sometimes sharpened by necessity. A strong working adult might be fed first because labor had to continue. That logic was practical, but it could also be painful. Religious life intersected with this reality in complicated ways. Medieval Christianity included fasting, abstinence, and a moral language around appetite, charity, and bodily discipline. But ritual fasting is not the same as involuntary hunger. For those who were already living near subsistence, the line between spiritual practice and bodily strain could blur in uncomfortable ways. The culture understood restraint, but many peasants needed no lesson in restraint. What they needed was enough. That contrast could produce a quiet irony at the heart of medieval life. The well-fed could speak about moderation with one kind of experience in mind. The poorly fed knew moderation as an unavoidable condition. And still, the language of religion also offered some dignity to suffering, some explanation, some framework through which hardship could be endured or interpreted. Charity mattered. Feast days mattered. The church calendar, for all its demands, also punctuated life with moments that could feel fuller, brighter, and more communal than the ordinary run of days. Those moments of relative abundance were powerful precisely because they stood against the backdrop of routine restraint. A feast, a holiday meal, a successful slaughtering season, the first signs of a good harvest, these were not merely pleasant events. They were emotional releases. Hunger makes memory sharper around food. People remembered good years because bad ones taught them the value of relief. Still, even in better years, medieval peasants lived close enough to the edge that one failure could begin a chain reaction. A poor harvest did not simply mean less bread. It could mean weaker bodies before the next planting, fewer reserves for animals, the sale of goods that should have been kept, debt, dependence, vulnerability to disease, and reduced resilience when the next problem arrived. Hunger was rarely alone. It opened the door for fever, infection, exhaustion, and despair. Malnutrition made people less able to recover, less able to work, and therefore less able to escape the conditions that had weakened them in the first place. In that sense, hunger was one of the hidden engines of medieval peasant life. It shaped the body, but it also shaped time, family strategy, local reputation, relations with authority, and the emotional atmosphere of the household. It influenced how cautiously people married, how many animals they could risk keeping, what they feared from weather, and what counted as good fortune. To be well-fed for long enough was not ordinary. It was a kind of security many people only approached unevenly. And perhaps the most important correction to the modern imagination is this: medieval peasants were not constantly in a spectacular state of famine, but many lived in a condition of recurring nutritional uncertainty that could become severe with frightening speed. Their world was not one endless catastrophe. It was something in its own way more exhausting, a life in which catastrophe was never very far away, and where ordinary hunger could deepen into real crisis if the harvest failed, if obligations stayed fixed, or if the weather turned at exactly the wrong time. So when we ask what hunger was really like for medieval peasants, we are not only asking what was on the table. We are asking what it felt like to build an entire life around the possibility that the table might not hold enough. And once that becomes clear, the fields, the cottages, the bread, the animals, even the calendar itself begin to look slightly different, because the next question is not simply how peasants ate, but how they endured a world in which one bad season could change the meaning of every meal that followed. Endurance, in this context, was not a single act of resilience, but a continuous adjustment to uncertainty. A peasant household did not simply react to hunger when it arrived. It anticipated it quietly and constantly, shaping behavior months in advance. Decisions made in autumn could determine the severity of spring. The amount of grain set aside, the condition of storage, the careful protection of seed, the choice to sell or keep a pig, all of these small judgments accumulated into a fragile line between sufficiency and shortage. Storage itself was a kind of silent gamble. Grain had to last, and lasting meant more than simply having enough at harvest. It meant defending it against damp, pests, rot, and careless handling. A well-filled granary could still betray its owner if moisture crept in unnoticed or vermin found their way inside. Medieval people were acutely aware of this vulnerability. The sight of spoiled grain was not just unpleasant. It was a quiet disaster, one that could not be easily reversed. Every lost portion shortened the distance to the lean months. Even when stores held, there was the question of how quickly they would be used. Consumption was rarely steady. It rose and fell with labor demands, with illness, with weather, with unexpected needs. A family might eat slightly more during periods of intense work, knowing that the strength gained now could prevent weakness later. But that choice carried risk. To eat more in the present was to trust that the future would not demand what had already been consumed. Hunger was often managed through such quiet calculations, never entirely certain, always balancing present need against future fear. The management of animals formed another layer of this delicate system. Livestock were not simply sources of food. They were part of the household strategy for surviving fluctuations. A cow provided milk that could be consumed fresh or turned into cheese, extending its usefulness. A pig could convert scraps into stored meat, but feeding it required resources that might otherwise go to people. In difficult times, animals might be slaughtered earlier than planned, bringing temporary relief at the cost of future stability. The decision to kill or keep was rarely simple. It was a negotiation between immediate hunger and long-term security. And there were other, less obvious pressures. Access to common land, for example, could significantly influence a household's resilience. Where peasants had rights to graze animals, gather wood, or collect certain wild foods, the margin against hunger widened slightly. Where those rights were restricted, enclosed, or contested, that margin narrowed. A poor harvest combined with limited access to supplementary resources could turn a manageable year into a dangerous one. So hunger was shaped not only by the soil and the sky, but by law, custom, and the shifting boundaries of communal life. This is where the experience of hunger begins to reveal something deeper about medieval society. It was not merely a biological condition. It was embedded in relationships between peasant and lord, between village and land, between household and season. When those relationships held steady, people could navigate hardship with some degree of predictability. But when they shifted, when obligations tightened, when rights were reduced, when prices rose or access changed, hunger could intensify even without a dramatic failure of crops. Markets, where they existed within reach, introduced another layer of possibility and uncertainty. In some regions, peasants could buy grain when their own supplies ran low, but this depended on having something to exchange. A household might sell small goods, labor, or possessions to obtain food, but each sale carried a cost. Tools sold could not be easily replaced. Animals traded reduced future productivity. Clothing given up meant less protection against cold. Hunger could push people into decisions that solved one problem while quietly creating another. And prices themselves were not stable. In years of scarcity, grain prices could rise sharply, placing it out of reach for those who needed it most. A peasant might stand in a market with just enough coin for yesterday's price, only to find that today's price demanded more. That small shift, almost invisible in a modern context, could determine whether a household ate adequately that week. Hunger, then, could be experienced not only in the field or the home, but in the space between expectation and reality, in the moment when what had been sufficient was suddenly not enough. Within the village, social bonds could soften these edges, but they could not eliminate them. Neighbors might lend, share, or assist, especially in times of acute difficulty. Kinship networks mattered. Reputation mattered. A family known for reliability or generosity in better times might find support more readily in worse ones. But these systems were not unlimited. When scarcity affected an entire community, the capacity to help narrowed. People could not give what they did not have. There is a tendency, when thinking about the past, to imagine that such hardship would have produced constant visible crisis. Yet much of the time it did not. Hunger often remained subdued, woven into ordinary life, expressed in quieter ways. It might appear in the thinning of bodies, in slower movement, in reduced endurance, in the careful stretching of meals. It might be present in the background of conversation, in the tone of decision-making, in the attention paid to small details that, in more secure circumstances, might not have mattered. Children growing up in such environments would have absorbed these patterns without necessarily naming them. They would have learned by observation how food was handled, how it was valued, how it was never taken for granted. They would have noticed which parts of the meal were distributed first, who received more, who received less, and why. They would have understood, even if only instinctively, that food was tied to effort, to timing, to luck, and to forces beyond their control. At the same time, there were moments when hunger became more visible, when the quiet management of scarcity gave way to something harder to conceal. A failed harvest, especially if repeated, could push communities beyond their ability to cope through ordinary means. Grain stores emptied more quickly. Prices rose more sharply. Animals were sold or slaughtered in greater numbers. People might travel in search of work or food, leaving familiar surroundings behind. These movements were not always dramatic migrations, but they signaled a shift from endurance to strain. Even then, famine, in the sense of widespread death, was not inevitable, but it became a possibility that people understood. Medieval communities carried memory of such events. Stories of past shortages, of years when things had gone badly, were part of local knowledge. These memories influenced behavior. They encouraged caution, sometimes even in relatively good years. Hunger was not only experienced in the present. It was remembered, anticipated, and feared based on what had happened before. And within that memory lay another subtle aspect of the experience. Hunger could feel unpredictable, even when its causes were partially understood. Weather patterns could change in ways that were difficult to anticipate with the tools available at the time. A season that began well could end poorly. A crop that looked promising could fail late. This uncertainty meant that confidence was always provisional. A good harvest brought relief, but rarely complete security. There was always the awareness that the next year might be different. This constant negotiation with uncertainty shaped not only physical survival, but emotional life. It influenced how people hoped, how they worried, how they planned, and how they interpreted events. A stretch of good years might encourage a sense of stability, but it could also lead to decisions that assumed that stability would continue. When conditions changed, those assumptions could become vulnerabilities. Hunger, in this sense, was not only about lack. It was about the fragile nature of expectation. In trying to understand what hunger was really like for medieval peasants, it becomes increasingly clear that it was not a single experience, but a spectrum. At one end, there was the everyday management of limited resources, the careful balancing that allowed life to continue. At the other, there were moments of acute crisis when that balance broke down. Most people lived somewhere between these extremes, moving closer to one or the other depending on the year, the season, and their particular circumstances. And yet, even within this spectrum, there were patterns that repeated with enough regularity to shape behavior across generations. The lean months returned. The harvest cycle repeated. The need to store, to ration, to plan remained constant. Over time, these patterns became part of the structure of life itself. Hunger was not an interruption. It was a condition that had to be lived with, managed, and, when possible, mitigated. This brings us to a quieter but revealing point. For all the hardship involved, medieval peasants developed ways of interpreting and giving meaning to these experiences. Not in a grand philosophical sense, but in the practical understanding that certain difficulties were expected, that certain risks were part of the world as they knew it. This did not make hunger easier, but it did shape how it was endured. It was not always seen as a failure of effort. It was often understood as part of a larger pattern that individuals could influence but not fully control. And still, within that acceptance, there remained a constant attention to improvement, however modest. Better storage, more careful planning, the accumulation of small reserves, the strengthening of social ties, all represented attempts to push back against the limits imposed by environment and system. These efforts did not eliminate hunger, but they could soften its edges, extend resilience, and create small pockets of security in an otherwise uncertain landscape. Which is why, when conditions shifted in more significant ways, when climate patterns changed, when population pressures increased, when political or economic systems evolved, the experience of hunger could also change, sometimes gradually, sometimes more abruptly, setting the stage for periods where the familiar balance between endurance and scarcity would be tested in ways that earlier generations had not quite experienced in the same form. One of the most important of these shifts came quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, through the slow growth of population across large parts of medieval Europe. As numbers increased over generations, the relationship between people and land began to tighten. Fields that had once seemed sufficient were divided and subdivided. Marginal lands, areas with thinner soil, poorer drainage, or harsher exposure, were brought into cultivation. At first, this expansion could feel like progress, a sign of vitality and growth. But it also meant that the margin for error narrowed even further. In such a landscape, hunger did not need a catastrophic event to intensify. It only needed a slight imbalance. A harvest that would once have been considered mediocre might now fall short of what a larger population required. A stretch of poor weather that could previously be absorbed might now expose the fragility of the system. The same rhythm of planting and reaping continued, but the consequences of variation became sharper. This tightening relationship between people and land also changed how labor was experienced. With more hands to feed and not always more fertile land to work, effort increased, but its rewards did not always grow at the same pace. Peasants could find themselves working longer hours, cultivating more difficult terrain, and still facing the same underlying uncertainty about whether it would be enough. Hunger, in this context, was not only a matter of scarcity. It was also a reflection of diminishing returns. At the same time, broader environmental changes began to alter the patterns that medieval communities had come to rely upon. Weather had always been a source of uncertainty, but there were periods when that uncertainty seemed to deepen. Colder, wetter conditions in some regions shortened growing seasons, affected yields, and made storage more difficult. Grain that might have dried properly in warmer conditions could now spoil more easily. Fields could become waterlogged. Livestock could suffer. These were not always dramatic events. Often, they were subtle shifts that accumulated over years. For a peasant household, the difference between a dry harvest and a damp one could determine how much of the grain remained usable months later. A slightly colder spring could delay planting just enough to affect the entire cycle. These were the kinds of details that rarely appear in simple historical summaries, but they were precisely the kinds of details that shaped whether hunger remained manageable or became more severe. And as these pressures accumulated, the relationship between peasants and the structures that governed their lives became even more significant. Obligations to lords, rents, and dues did not always adjust smoothly to changing conditions. A poor year did not necessarily reduce what was owed. In some cases, it could even increase pressure, as those higher in the social hierarchy sought to maintain their own standards of living. This created a tension that was not always visible, but was deeply felt. A peasant might stand in a field that had produced less than expected, already calculating how much must be set aside for rent, how much for seed, and how little would remain for the household. The arithmetic of survival became tighter, more unforgiving. Each portion had a claim, and the household itself was only one of those claims. Yet even within these constraints, adaptation continued. People adjusted cropping patterns where they could, experimented with different grains, or altered the balance between crops and livestock. In some regions, the cultivation of hardier grains provided a degree of stability, even if it meant accepting lower quality food. Barley, oats, and rye could thrive in conditions where wheat struggled. The resulting bread might be darker, denser, less desirable by certain standards, but it could sustain life when other options failed. This introduces another quiet but important detail. Not all hunger looked the same. There was a difference between absolute lack and nutritional compromise. A household might have enough to avoid starvation, but the quality of that food could still shape health in lasting ways. Diets heavily dependent on a narrow range of grains could lead to deficiencies, weakening the body over time. Hunger, in this sense, was not always visible as emptiness. It could be present in subtle forms of malnutrition, in fatigue, in vulnerability to illness. These distinctions mattered because they influenced how people experienced their own condition. A peasant might not describe themselves as starving, but they might still feel the constant strain of not quite having enough of the right things. This kind of hunger is quieter, but no less real. It affects how one works, how one recovers, how one ages. And as pressures mounted, the capacity of communities to absorb shocks began to vary more sharply. In some areas, networks of support, access to resources, or relative stability allowed people to navigate difficult periods with resilience. In others, the same pressures could tip the balance more quickly. Local conditions mattered. Geography mattered. Even small differences in soil, climate, and social structure could influence how hunger unfolded. There is also a tendency to think of medieval peasants as isolated from wider systems, but in reality, many were connected, directly or indirectly, to broader economic currents. Trade routes, urban demand, and regional markets could influence the availability and price of food. A bad harvest in one region might be offset to some degree by imports from another, but this depended on infrastructure, cost, and access. For those on the margins, these connections could feel distant or unreliable. When prices rose in response to scarcity, those with limited means felt the impact first. A slight increase could be absorbed by wealthier households, but for peasants living close to subsistence, it could represent a meaningful loss of access. Hunger, once again, was not only about production. It was about distribution, about who could obtain what was available and at what cost. And yet, despite all of this, medieval life did not consist solely of decline or hardship. There were periods of relative stability, even modest prosperity, when harvests were good, conditions favorable, and communities able to rebuild their reserves. These periods were important not only for immediate relief, but for restoring the capacity to endure future difficulties. A well-stocked year could provide a buffer, a chance to recover strength, to repair tools, to maintain animals, to strengthen the household's position. But such periods also carried a subtle risk. When conditions improved, it was natural for expectations to adjust. People might grow slightly more confident, slightly less cautious. They might expand cultivation, take on additional obligations, or reduce the strictness of rationing. These were not reckless decisions. They were reasonable responses to improved circumstances. Yet they also meant that when conditions turned again, the system might be less prepared than it had been in more cautious times. This cycle of tightening and loosening, of strain and relief, created a kind of long-term rhythm that shaped generations. Hunger was not constant in its severity, but it was constant in its presence as a possibility. It influenced how people thought about the future, how they managed the present, and how they remembered the past. It is within this context that more severe crises begin to take on their full meaning. When multiple pressures aligned, when population density, environmental conditions, economic structures, and social obligations all moved in unfavorable directions at the same time, the familiar strategies of endurance could begin to fail. What had once been manageable became overwhelming. And it is at precisely this point, when the ordinary mechanisms of coping were stretched beyond their limits, that the experience of hunger began to shift from something difficult but navigable into something far more dangerous, setting the stage for moments in medieval history when entire communities would confront not just scarcity, but the real and immediate threat of collapse in the systems that had, until then, allowed them to endure. When that threshold was crossed, the change was rarely sudden in the way modern imagination sometimes prefers. It did not always begin with empty fields or abandoned villages. Instead, it often started with small signs that something familiar was beginning to slip. A harvest that was not simply disappointing, but noticeably worse than expected. Rain that lingered too long, turning fields heavy and difficult to work. Grain that failed to dry properly, leading to losses not immediately visible, but steadily accumulating. At first, people responded as they always had, by adjusting, by tightening, by relying on habits shaped over generations. Meals were made thinner. Reserves were guarded more carefully. Less essential consumption was cut back. There was still, at this stage, a sense that the system might hold, that this was another difficult year, not an irreversible one. But when poor conditions continued, or when a second year followed the first, the nature of hunger began to change. The reserves that had once provided a buffer were no longer sufficient. Grain stores, already reduced, could not be replenished at the usual level. The careful balance between consumption and preservation became harder to maintain, and the choices facing households grew more severe. One of the first signs of deeper strain was the gradual erosion of what might be called the household's future. Animals that had been kept for their long-term value were sold or slaughtered earlier than planned. Tools might be traded away. Clothing, bedding, or small possessions could be exchanged for food. These decisions brought immediate relief, but they quietly weakened the household's ability to recover when conditions improved. This is where hunger begins to reveal its more structural consequences. It was not only a matter of enduring less food for a time. It was a process that could strip away the very means by which a household sustained itself. Once those means were reduced, the next season, even if better, would be faced from a weaker position. At the same time, the broader community felt the strain. Where once neighbors might have been able to support one another, their capacity to do so diminished as their own reserves declined. Lending became more difficult. Generosity, though still present in spirit, was constrained by necessity. A village that had once shared small burdens now found itself confronting a larger one that could not be easily distributed. Markets, too, reflected this tightening. As supply fell and demand rose, prices increased, sometimes sharply. For those with coin or goods to exchange, there might still be access to food, though at a cost. For those without, the market became a place of frustration rather than relief. The presence of grain in a town or city did not guarantee that it could be obtained. Hunger, in this sense, became visible not only in absence but in inequality, food existing but out of reach. And yet, even as these pressures intensified, people continued to act within the framework they understood. They sought work where it could be found. They traveled short distances in search of better conditions. They appealed to local authorities, to religious institutions, to anyone who might provide assistance. These actions were not signs of collapse, but of continued effort to remain within the system, to find a way through. However, there were limits to what effort alone could achieve. When environmental conditions remained unfavorable, when economic pressures did not ease, and when obligations persisted, the cumulative effect could push communities beyond their ability to adapt through ordinary means. Hunger, which had once been managed, now began to dominate daily life in a more immediate way. Food was no longer simply rationed. It was searched for. People turned increasingly to alternatives that, in better times, would have been avoided or used sparingly. Wild plants, roots, and other gathered foods took on greater importance. Some of these could supplement diets effectively, but others offered little nourishment or carried risks. Knowledge of what could be safely consumed became critical, and even then, the results were not always reliable. The diet, already limited in many cases, narrowed further. Variety disappeared. Meals became repetitive not by choice, but by necessity. The body, already under strain, had fewer resources with which to maintain itself. Illness, when it came, found less resistance. This interplay between hunger and health is one of the more subtle but significant aspects of the experience. Malnutrition weakened the body, making it more susceptible to disease. At the same time, illness reduced a person's ability to work, to gather food, to contribute to the household's survival. It created a cycle in which hunger and sickness reinforced one another. Children, the elderly, and those already vulnerable were often the first to feel these effects most severely. Their capacity to endure prolonged shortage was limited, and their dependence on others meant that the household's decisions had direct consequences for their survival. Hunger, in this sense, was not evenly distributed even within a single family. It reflected both necessity and difficult prioritization. As conditions worsened, movement became more common, not always in large, visible waves, but in smaller, quieter shifts. Individuals or families might leave in search of work, of food, of opportunity elsewhere. These movements could alter the fabric of communities, reducing labor in some places, increasing pressure in others. They were part of the broader response to scarcity, a sign that local solutions were no longer sufficient. Yet even in movement, there was uncertainty. Traveling did not guarantee improvement. Other regions might be facing similar difficulties. Opportunities could be limited. The decision to leave was often made without clear knowledge of what awaited, driven more by necessity than by confidence. At the same time, institutions that had once provided a degree of stability were themselves under strain. Local authorities might attempt to regulate prices or control the movement of grain, but their ability to do so effectively varied. Religious institutions might offer charity, but their resources were not infinite. In times of widespread difficulty, even these sources of support could be stretched thin. This gradual intensification of hunger, from manageable scarcity to more acute distress, was not uniform across all regions or periods. Some areas were better able to withstand these pressures due to geography, resources, or social structure. Others were more vulnerable. But when conditions aligned unfavorably over larger areas, the effects could become more widespread, more visible, and more difficult to contain. And as this process unfolded, something else began to change as well, the perception of the future. Where once there had been a sense, however cautious, that the next harvest might restore balance, that expectation could begin to weaken. Confidence, always provisional, became more fragile. People continued to plant, to work, to hope, but the certainty that effort would be rewarded was no longer as strong. This shift in perception is important because it marks a transition not only in material conditions, but in the psychological landscape of medieval life. Hunger was no longer simply a challenge to be managed within a known pattern. It began to feel like a disruption of that pattern itself. And it is at this point, when both the material and the emotional structures that supported endurance begin to strain, that the stage is set for some of the most difficult episodes in medieval history, moments when the familiar rhythms of agriculture, community, and survival would be tested against conditions that exceeded what those systems had been built to withstand, pushing them toward outcomes that would reshape not only individual lives, but the broader trajectory of the societies in which they lived. One of the clearest ways to understand this shift is to look closely at what happened when the rhythm of the seasons itself began to falter. Medieval agriculture depended on timing that was not written down in manuals so much as it was learned through experience. When to plow, when to sow, when to expect rain, when to harvest. This knowledge was not exact, but it was reliable enough under stable conditions. When those conditions became less predictable, the knowledge itself did not disappear, but its usefulness began to erode. A spring that arrived too late or too cold could delay planting beyond the optimal window. Seeds put into the ground at the wrong time did not simply grow more slowly. They might fail to establish at all. A summer that was too wet could rot crops before they matured, or make it impossible to bring in the harvest at the right moment. A harvest that could not be gathered quickly enough might spoil in the field, or be lost to early storms. These were not isolated inconveniences. They interfered with the entire cycle on which peasant survival depended. And because each stage of the agricultural year depended on the one before it, a disruption early in the season could echo forward, shaping outcomes months later. Hunger, in this sense, often began long before it was felt directly. It began in the soil, in the sky, in the quiet misalignment between expectation and reality. As these disruptions accumulated, they began to expose something that had always been present but was now more difficult to ignore: the narrowness of the system's margin for recovery. In better times, a poor result in one part of the cycle could be offset by strength in another. But when multiple stages were affected, the capacity for compensation diminished. This is where the experience of hunger began to take on a different texture. It was no longer only about having less. It was about the loss of predictability. A peasant could endure a difficult year if it felt like an exception. It was far harder to endure a sequence of years in which each one seemed to carry its own uncertainty. And with that uncertainty came a subtle but important shift in behavior. Households became more cautious, but caution itself had limits. To hold back too much in the present could weaken the ability to work and survive immediately. To spend too freely risked future scarcity. The balance between these choices became harder to judge when the patterns that guided them were less dependable. This tension could be felt even in small daily acts. The way grain was measured before being ground, the way portions were distributed at the table, the decision to use or save a particular ingredient, all carried a slightly greater weight when the future was less certain. Hunger, in this phase, was not always visible as emptiness. It was present as hesitation, as calculation, as the careful stretching of what remained. At the same time, the broader environment in which peasants lived continued to shape their options. Forests, rivers, and uncultivated land could provide supplementary resources, but access to these was not always guaranteed. Rights to gather wood, to fish, to forage could be limited or contested, especially as population pressures increased. What had once been a reliable supplement might become restricted, reducing the household's ability to compensate for poor harvests. This restriction did not always come suddenly. It could emerge gradually, through changes in custom, through enforcement of existing rules, or through shifts in ownership and control. But its effect was cumulative. Each small reduction in access narrowed the range of strategies available to those trying to manage scarcity. And yet, even as options narrowed, the instinct to adapt remained strong. People sought new ways to make use of what was available. They experimented within the limits of their knowledge and environment. They adjusted not only what they ate, but how they prepared it, how they combined ingredients, how they extended the usefulness of each portion. Cooking, in this context, was not merely a domestic task. It was an act of survival. The transformation of raw ingredients into something that could sustain the body, that could be shared, that could last, was central to how hunger was managed. Techniques that might seem simple on the surface, boiling, baking, fermenting, were applied with careful attention to efficiency and preservation. Even so, there were boundaries to what skill alone could achieve. When the underlying supply diminished beyond a certain point, no amount of careful preparation could fully compensate. The body required a certain level of nourishment, and when that level was not met over time, the effects accumulated. This accumulation is one of the reasons why prolonged periods of difficulty were so dangerous. A single poor season might be endured with strain, but without permanent damage. A sequence of poor seasons, however, could gradually wear down both physical strength and material reserves. Recovery became harder, not because effort diminished, but because the starting point was weaker. It is also important to recognize that these processes did not unfold in isolation. They were observed, discussed, and interpreted within communities. People shared information about the state of crops, about weather patterns, about prices in nearby markets. This exchange of knowledge could help households make better decisions, but it could also spread anxiety. News of poor conditions elsewhere could reinforce the sense that the problem was not local or temporary. At the same time, authorities, whether local lords, town officials, or regional powers, began to respond in various ways. Some attempted to regulate the flow of grain, to prevent hoarding, or to stabilize prices. Others focused on maintaining order, concerned that scarcity could lead to unrest. These responses were not always coordinated, and their effectiveness varied widely. But they reflect an awareness that hunger, when it reached a certain level, was not only a private hardship. It had broader implications for stability. Within villages, the effects of these pressures could be seen in subtle shifts in routine. Work might begin earlier or extend later as people tried to compensate for lost time or poor conditions. Tasks that could be delayed in better years were now completed with greater urgency. There was less room for rest, for error, for delay. And yet, despite the increasing strain, the fundamental structure of life continued. Fields were still plowed, seeds still sown, animals still tended. This persistence is important because it shows that even under pressure, the system did not immediately collapse. It continued to function, though under growing stress. But as the stress accumulated, the difference between functioning and failing became narrower. A single additional disruption, a storm at the wrong moment, a disease affecting crops or animals, an unexpected obligation, could tip the balance. And it is at precisely this narrowing point, when the system is still operating but with diminishing resilience, that the next phase begins to take shape. A phase in which the ordinary strategies of endurance are no longer enough, and where the experience of hunger begins to move from a condition that can be managed within the existing framework to one that starts to challenge that framework itself, pushing communities toward decisions and outcomes that would have seemed unthinkable in more stable times. In these moments, one of the first changes was not necessarily visible in the landscape, but in the pace of decision-making. Where once choices could be spaced out, considered, and adjusted over weeks or months, Now they became more immediate, more reactive. A household might no longer be planning for the next season with cautious optimism, but for the next few days with quiet urgency. Time itself seemed to compress. This compression affected how risk was understood. Under normal conditions, medieval peasants were cautious by necessity. But when pressure intensified, risk-taking could increase, not because people became reckless, but because the range of safe options had narrowed. Actions that would once have been avoided, such as consuming seed grain, reducing breeding stock, or overworking already strained land, became more likely, simply because the alternatives were fewer. To eat seed grain, for instance, was not a decision taken lightly. It represented a direct threat to the next harvest. But in a moment of immediate need, the future could feel less certain than the present hunger. The calculation shifted. Survival today took precedence over the possibility of survival tomorrow. And once that threshold was crossed, the consequences extended beyond a single season. Land itself could begin to suffer under this strain. Fields that were overused without adequate recovery could produce less in subsequent years. Soil fertility, already dependent on careful management, could decline if animals were fewer and manure less available. The very ground that sustained life could, under pressure, become less capable of doing so. At the same time, the relationship between peasants and their obligations could become more strained. When a household was already operating at the edge of survival, the demand to meet rents or labor services could feel increasingly burdensome. In some cases, there might be attempts to negotiate, to delay, or to reduce what was owed. In others, obligations were enforced more strictly, adding another layer of pressure to an already difficult situation. This tension did not always result in open conflict, but it could alter the tone of daily life. Interactions that had once been routine took on a sharper edge. The margin for patience narrowed. Hunger, which had already shaped private decisions, began to influence relationships more visibly. Within the household, too, the strain deepened. The careful distribution of food became even more critical, and the consequences of those decisions more immediate. There might be less room to protect the most vulnerable. Choices that had once been guided by a balance of care and practicality now leaned more heavily toward necessity. The emotional weight of these decisions should not be underestimated. They were not made abstractly. They were felt. And yet, even in these conditions, there remained a determination to maintain some sense of order. Daily routines continued where they could. Tasks were completed. Fields were worked. Animals were tended. This persistence was not simply habit. It was a way of holding on to structure in a moment when so much else felt uncertain. However, the accumulation of strain could begin to produce visible changes in the community itself. Houses might fall into disrepair if materials could not be spared for maintenance. Tools might become worn or broken without immediate replacement. Clothing might be patched and repatched until it could no longer serve its purpose effectively. These were small signs, but they indicated a broader weakening of the material base on which daily life depended. At the same time, movement within and between communities could become more noticeable. Where once people had remained largely in place, tied to land and obligation, the pressure of hunger could encourage greater mobility. Some sought seasonal work in areas less affected. Others moved more permanently, leaving behind land that could no longer sustain them. This movement had its own consequences. It could reduce labor in one place while increasing competition in another. It could disrupt established relationships and create new ones. It could also spread the effects of scarcity, carrying not only people but the conditions that had shaped their decisions into new regions. In towns and cities, the presence of newcomers could be both a source of labor and a sign of distress. Urban centers, with their markets and opportunities, might appear as places of relief, but they were not immune to the same pressures. Food had to be supplied, And when supply was limited, demand from a growing population could intensify competition. Authorities, aware of these dynamics, sometimes attempted to manage them through regulation, controlling prices, limiting movement, or organizing relief. But these measures were often constrained by resources and by the scale of the problem. They could mitigate but rarely eliminate the underlying pressures. Within this complex environment, the experience of hunger became increasingly layered. It was no longer only about the body's need for food. It was about the erosion of stability, the narrowing of options, the shifting of relationships, and the growing sense that the familiar patterns of life were under strain. And yet, it is important to recognize that even in such conditions, people did not simply succumb. They continued to act, to adapt, to seek ways through. They relied on knowledge passed down through generations, on social ties, on whatever resources remained available. Hunger, even in its more severe forms, did not erase agency. It constrained it, shaped it, but did not eliminate it. This persistence, however, could not fully shield communities from the cumulative effects of prolonged difficulty. As one season gave way to the next, the question was no longer simply whether the immediate crisis could be endured, but whether the underlying system could recover. Could the land be restored? Could herds be rebuilt? Could households regain the reserves they had lost? These questions did not have immediate answers. They depended on future conditions, on the return of more favorable weather, on the easing of pressures. But in the moment, they remained open, unresolved, shaping the choices that people made even as they continued to plant, to work, and to hope. And it is in this space, between continued effort and uncertain recovery, that the next development begins to emerge, one that would further complicate the relationship between people, land, and food, as the structures that govern medieval life themselves began to shift in response to the very pressures that hunger had helped to reveal. One of the more subtle but consequential shifts occurred in how communities and authorities began to think about scarcity itself. Hunger had long been treated as something cyclical, a hardship that came and went with the seasons. But when difficult conditions persisted, or when they appeared more frequently than memory suggested they should, that understanding began to change. Scarcity started to feel less like an interruption and more like a condition that required management at a broader level. In some regions, this meant closer attention to the movement of grain. Lords, town officials, and other authorities began to take a more active interest in how food was stored, traded, and distributed. Grain was no longer simply a commodity or a household reserve. It became, in a quiet sense, a matter of stability. Decisions about where it could be sold, at what price, and in what quantity began to carry wider implications. This shift did not always favor the peasantry. Attempts to control prices or restrict exports could protect certain populations, but they could also distort local markets in ways that were difficult to predict. A measure intended to stabilize supply might discourage traders from bringing grain into a region. A restriction meant to prevent hoarding might reduce incentives to store surplus in the first place. Hunger, already shaped by a complex web of factors, became entangled with policies that could both alleviate and exacerbate the problem. At the same time, the role of towns and cities began to take on greater importance. Urban centers, with their growing populations, required steady supplies of food. This demand could draw grain away from rural areas, particularly when prices in towns were higher. For peasants with surplus to sell, this might offer an opportunity. But in times of scarcity, it could also create tension, as food moved toward markets where it could command a better price, rather than remaining within the communities that had produced it. This movement of grain reveals another layer of the experience of hunger. It was not always confined to the place where it was produced. It could be influenced by distant demand, by trade routes, by the relative power of buyers and sellers. A poor household might live within sight of fields that had yielded a harvest, yet find that the produce of those fields was no longer accessible to them. Such dynamics could deepen the sense of imbalance. Hunger, which had always contained elements of inequality, now became more visibly connected to broader economic forces. The question was no longer only how much food existed, but who controlled it and how it was allocated. Within this changing environment, social responses to hunger also began to evolve. Charity, which had long been a part of medieval life, took on renewed significance. Religious institutions, in particular, were expected to provide assistance to those in need. Almsgiving, the distribution of food, and other forms of support were not only acts of compassion but expressions of moral and social order. Yet charity, like all other resources, had limits. It could alleviate immediate suffering, but it could not always address the underlying causes of scarcity. And when need was widespread, the capacity to provide aid was stretched thin. The presence of charity did not eliminate hunger. It coexisted with it, offering moments of relief within a broader landscape of difficulty. At the household level, adaptation continued in increasingly constrained forms. The careful management of food remained central, but the margin for adjustment grew smaller. There was less room to absorb mistakes, less flexibility in responding to unexpected changes. The skills that had once allowed families to navigate ordinary scarcity were now being tested against more persistent and severe conditions. This pressure could also alter how people related to time. In more stable periods, the agricultural year provided a sense of rhythm and predictability. Even with its challenges, it offered a structure that could be relied upon. But as conditions became less stable, that rhythm began to feel less certain. The future, once anticipated with cautious expectation, became harder to read. This uncertainty extended beyond the immediate question of food. It influenced decisions about family, about work, about investment in land or animals. A household might hesitate to expand its efforts if the return was uncertain. It might delay or reconsider commitments that would have seemed reasonable in more stable times. Hunger, in this way, shaped not only what people ate, but how they thought about the future. And yet, despite these shifts, there remained a persistent effort to maintain continuity. Fields were still cultivated. Seeds were still sown. Communities still organized themselves around the tasks required for survival. This continuity is important because it shows that even under increasing pressure, the fundamental structure of medieval life did not simply dissolve. It adapted, strained, and sometimes bent, but it did not immediately break. However, as the balance between resilience and strain continued to narrow, the consequences of disruption became more pronounced. A poor harvest in such a context did not merely add to existing difficulty. It could amplify it, pushing conditions from manageable scarcity into more acute crisis. This amplification is key to understanding how hunger could escalate. It was not always the result of a single catastrophic event. More often, it emerged from the interaction of multiple pressures, environmental, economic, social, that reinforced one another. Each factor alone might be endured. Together, they could overwhelm. Within this environment, even the perception of normality began to shift. What had once been considered a difficult year might now be seen as comparatively manageable. Expectations adjusted, sometimes downward, as people recalibrated what counted as acceptable or tolerable. Hunger, in this sense, was not only a physical experience. It was also a changing standard. This recalibration could have subtle effects on behavior. If scarcity became more common, it might be met with a kind of resigned acceptance. But that acceptance did not remove its impact. It simply altered how it was interpreted and responded to. At the same time, there were moments when conditions improved, when harvests were better, when pressure eased slightly. These moments were important not only for immediate relief, but for restoring some measure of confidence. They reminded communities that recovery was possible, that the system could still function under more favorable conditions. Yet even in these periods of relative improvement, the memory of recent hardship lingered. It influenced how people used their surplus, how they planned, how cautious they remained. A good year did not erase the experience of previous ones. It existed alongside it, shaping decisions in ways that were not always immediately visible. And so the experience of hunger continued to evolve, shaped by a complex interplay of factors that extended beyond the field and into the broader structures of medieval life. It was no longer simply a matter of seasonal scarcity or occasional crisis. It had become part of a larger pattern of pressure and adaptation, one that would continue to develop as conditions changed and as societies responded to the challenges it presented. It is within this evolving pattern that the next phase of the story begins to take shape, as communities, authorities, and individuals alike confronted the question of how to respond not just to immediate scarcity, but to a world in which the conditions that produced that scarcity were themselves becoming less predictable and perhaps more difficult to control. One of the more revealing responses to this growing uncertainty was a gradual shift in how risk was distributed across society. In more stable periods, much of the burden of poor harvests fell directly on peasant households, absorbed through their own stores, labor, and local networks. But as pressures intensified, there were increasing attempts, sometimes informal, sometimes more structured, to spread that risk more broadly. This did not necessarily mean fairness in a modern sense. Rather, it reflected a recognition, however partial, that extreme scarcity could destabilize entire regions. When hunger became widespread, it threatened not only individual survival but the functioning of the social order itself. Fields left untilled, laborers too weak to work, rising unrest, declining rents. These were not isolated concerns. They touched every level of the system. As a result, some authorities began to take a more active role in monitoring harvests and anticipating shortages. Information about crop conditions, weather patterns, and local yields became more valuable. In some areas, records were kept with greater care, not out of abstract interest, but because they could inform decisions about taxation, storage, and distribution. This attention to information marks an important shift. Hunger was no longer only something to be endured. It was something to be understood, tracked, and, where possible, managed. The tools for doing so were limited, but the intention itself reflects a growing awareness of the interconnectedness of agricultural life. At the same time, communities themselves continued to rely on more immediate forms of knowledge, observation, memory, and shared experience. The color of crops, the feel of soil, the behavior of animals, the timing of seasonal changes. These were all read as signs. They did not provide certainty, but they offered clues, a way of navigating uncertainty with the senses and the accumulated wisdom of previous generations. Yet even with these efforts, the underlying challenge remained. The system could be observed, even influenced at the margins, but it could not be fully controlled. Weather could not be commanded. Disease could not be entirely prevented. Markets could not always be stabilized. Hunger, therefore, retained an element of unpredictability that no amount of observation could entirely remove. This unpredictability shaped not only practical decisions, but also the emotional tone of life. There was a kind of guardedness in expectation, a reluctance to assume that good conditions would last. Even in moments of relative abundance, there could be an undercurrent of caution, a sense that the present might not extend into the future. At the household level, this often translated into a continued emphasis on preservation. Surplus, when it existed, was rarely treated casually. Grain was stored carefully. Food was processed in ways that extended its life. Waste, to the extent it could be avoided, was minimized. These practices were not new, but under conditions of increased uncertainty, they took on even greater importance. And yet, preservation had its limits. Stored food could sustain a household only for so long. If new supply did not arrive in time, if the next harvest did not restore balance, then even the most careful storage would eventually be exhausted. This is where the experience of hunger began to intersect more directly with time, not just in the seasonal sense, but in the sense of duration. A short period of shortage might be endured with strain but without lasting damage. A longer period began to erode reserves. An extended period could fundamentally alter a household's capacity to recover. The length of scarcity, as much as its severity, determined its impact. This brings into focus another aspect of medieval hunger that is often overlooked: its cumulative nature. Hunger was rarely experienced as a single event. It was a process unfolding over weeks, months, sometimes years. Each stage left its mark, reducing the capacity to respond to the next. Within this process, small differences could have large effects. A household with slightly more land, slightly better soil, or slightly stronger social connections might endure a difficult period with less lasting damage. Another, with fewer resources, might find itself pushed beyond recovery. These differences were not always visible at the outset, but they became clearer as conditions worsened. This uneven impact contributed to changes within communities themselves. Over time, disparities could widen. Some households might recover more quickly after a difficult period, while others struggled to rebuild. Hunger, therefore, was not only a shared experience, it could also be a dividing one. At the same time, the cultural understanding of hunger continued to evolve. It remained connected to moral and religious frameworks, to ideas about charity, humility, and the proper ordering of society. But it also became more closely associated with practical concerns, management, foresight, adaptation. These different ways of understanding hunger coexisted, sometimes reinforcing one another, sometimes creating tension. For those living through these conditions, however, the experience was less about abstract interpretation and more about immediate reality. It was about the feel of the body, the weight of labor, the uncertainty of the next meal, the constant awareness of what remained and what did not. And yet, even within this reality, there were moments that offered a kind of fragile stability. A successful harvest, even a modest one, could restore a measure of balance. It could replenish stores, strengthen bodies, and provide a brief respite from the constant calculation of scarcity. These moments were not merely physical relief. They were also emotional resets. They allowed people to imagine, however cautiously, that the system could still function, that the patterns they relied upon had not entirely broken down. They provided the space in which recovery could begin. But recovery, when it came, was often incomplete. The losses incurred during periods of scarcity, animals sold, tools lost, soil depleted, health weakened, could not always be fully reversed in a single season. The system might return to a state of functioning, but it did so from a slightly altered position, one shaped by what had been lost. This incremental change is important because it suggests that hunger was not only a response to conditions. It was also a force that reshaped those conditions over time. Each period of scarcity left behind traces that influenced how future scarcity would be experienced. And as these traces accumulated, they began to alter the broader trajectory of medieval life. The relationship between people and land, between production and consumption, between local and regional systems, all were gradually affected. It is within this ongoing process of adjustment and readjustment that the next development begins to emerge, one in which the pressures created by hunger start to interact more directly with shifts in labor, in land use, and in the balance of power within medieval society, setting in motion changes that would extend far beyond the immediate question of food, and into the very structure of how people lived and worked. As hunger persisted or returned with increasing regularity, the value of labor itself began to shift in subtle ways. In a system where most people were tied, in varying degrees, to the land they worked, the assumption had long been that labor would be available as needed. But under prolonged strain, that assumption became less certain. When households weakened, when illness spread, when some individuals left in search of better conditions, the steady availability of labor could no longer be taken for granted. This had consequences that moved outward from the individual body into the wider structure of rural life. Fields required timely work, and that work depended on human strength. If fewer people were able to contribute fully, or if those who remained were working under diminished physical condition, the efficiency of agricultural cycles could be affected. Tasks might take longer, some might be delayed, others might be performed with less precision. At first, these changes might appear minor, almost imperceptible. But over time, they could accumulate. A slightly delayed harvest could increase the risk of spoilage. A less thorough preparation of fields could reduce yields. The system, already under pressure from environmental and economic factors, now faced an additional strain from within. This is where the relationship between hunger and labor becomes particularly revealing. Hunger did not simply result from poor production. It could also contribute to it. A weakened population was less able to produce the food it needed, creating a cycle that reinforced itself. At the same time, those who held authority over land and labor began to notice these shifts. The expectation that obligations, whether in the form of rents, services, or produce, would be met consistently became harder to sustain. In some cases, this led to attempts to reinforce those expectations, to ensure that existing structures remained intact despite the strain. But reinforcement was not always straightforward. Pressing too hard on a weakened population could produce diminishing returns. If peasants were pushed beyond their capacity, the result might not be increased productivity, but further decline. This created a tension within the system, the need to maintain order and output balanced against the reality of reduced capacity. In response, there were moments where adjustments were made, whether formally or informally. Some obligations might be modified, delayed, or renegotiated. These changes were not uniform, and they did not always favor those at the bottom of the hierarchy. But they reflect an awareness, however limited, that the system could not function in exactly the same way under altered conditions. Meanwhile, at the level of the individual household, decisions about labor took on new significance. The allocation of effort, who worked, when, and how, became even more critical. A family might prioritize certain tasks over others, focusing on those that promised the most immediate return. Less essential work might be deferred, even if it carried long-term consequences. Children, too, could be drawn more deeply into labor as conditions tightened. Tasks that might once have been reserved for adults could be shared more widely within the household. This was not a sudden change, but an intensification of existing patterns, shaped by necessity rather than choice. At the same time, there were limits to how much labor could compensate for scarcity. Effort alone could not create favorable weather or restore depleted soil, could not guarantee that crops would succeed. This is another point where the experience of hunger reveals its deeper complexity. It was not simply a problem to be solved through harder work. It was a condition that often resisted effort, no matter how sustained. And yet, the instinct to work, to persist, remained central. Even in difficult conditions, the act of labor carried meaning. It was a way of engaging with the land, of maintaining a sense of purpose, of holding onto the routines that structured life. To stop working entirely would not only reduce the chance of survival. It would also represent a kind of surrender to uncertainty. Within communities, the shifting dynamics of labor could also influence relationships. Households that retained more strength or resources might find themselves in a position to assist others, whether through shared work, lending, or informal agreements. These interactions could strengthen bonds, But they could also create new dependencies, altering the balance within the village. At the same time, those who were less able to contribute labor might become more vulnerable. The social fabric that supported them could stretch under pressure, sometimes holding, sometimes fraying. Hunger, once again, was not evenly distributed. It moved through the community in ways that reflected both material conditions and social connections. Another layer of complexity emerged as land use itself began to adjust in response to these pressures. Fields that had been cultivated intensively might be allowed to rest, either deliberately or through necessity, as households lacked the capacity to work them fully. In other cases, marginal lands might be abandoned if they no longer produced enough to justify the effort required. These changes were not always coordinated or planned. They emerged from countless individual decisions, each shaped by immediate circumstances. But collectively, they could alter the landscape, shifting patterns of cultivation and, over time, influencing the overall productivity of a region. This gradual reshaping of land use reflects an important aspect of medieval life: its adaptability. Even under strain, people adjusted their practices in response to changing conditions. They did not have the tools to transform the system entirely, but they could modify their approach within its limits. At the same time, these adjustments could have unintended consequences. Reducing cultivation in one area might preserve resources in the short term, but it could also reduce overall output. Expanding into new areas might increase production temporarily, but at the cost of long-term sustainability. Each decision carried trade-offs, often without clear solutions. As these patterns unfolded, the relationship between hunger and the broader structure of society continued to deepen. It was no longer only a matter of survival at the household level. It was influencing how labor was organized, how land was used, how obligations were understood, and how authority was exercised. And yet, even as these deeper changes took shape, the daily experience of hunger remained grounded in the familiar rhythms of life. Meals were still prepared, however modest. Fields were still worked, however strained. Communities still gathered, still exchanged information, still sought ways to endure. This coexistence of continuity and change is one of the defining features of the period. The surface of life could appear stable, even as underlying structures were shifting. Hunger, in its quiet persistence, was both a symptom of these changes and a force that helped to drive them. And as these shifts continued to unfold, they began to intersect more directly with broader transformations taking place across medieval society. Changes in population movement, in economic relationships, and in the organization of work, drawing the experience of hunger into a wider pattern of transition that would continue to develop in the years that followed, carrying both the memory of past scarcity and the uncertainty of what might come next. One of the more telling signs of this transition was the way hunger began to influence not just how people lived, but where they chose or were forced to live. Movement, which had once been limited and often discouraged by the structure of rural obligations, became more frequent under pressure. It did not always take the form of large migrations. More often, it appeared as a steady, almost quiet drifting, individuals seeking seasonal work, families relocating to areas where conditions seemed slightly more favorable, or where opportunities, however uncertain, might exist. This gradual redistribution of people altered the balance between regions. Some areas experienced a thinning of population, fields left partially unattended, and a reduction in local output. Others saw an influx of labor, which could increase competition for resources while also offering the potential for greater productivity under the right conditions. Hunger, in this way, did not simply affect isolated communities. It moved with people, reshaping patterns across a broader landscape. At the same time, these movements began to interact with changes in economic relationships. In regions where labor became less readily available, its value could shift. Work that had once been expected as part of obligation might begin to carry a different weight when fewer people were able or willing to provide it. This did not immediately transform the system, but it introduced a subtle tension between expectation and reality. For those who controlled land, this tension required adjustment. Maintaining productivity depended not only on the land itself, but on the people who worked it. When those people were fewer, weaker, or more mobile, the balance of power could begin to shift, if only slightly. Agreements that had once been rigid might become more flexible. In some cases, incentives might be offered to retain or attract labor. In others, enforcement might be tightened, reflecting an attempt to preserve existing structures. These responses varied widely, but they all point to a system in motion, influenced by the pressures of hunger in ways that extended beyond immediate survival. The question was no longer only how to endure scarcity, but how to maintain a functioning order in its presence. Within this shifting environment, the daily experience of hunger continued to shape behavior in quieter, more personal ways. The memory of recent hardship influenced how people approached even relatively stable periods. A household that had endured a difficult stretch might remain cautious long after conditions improved, storing more carefully, consuming more conservatively, and maintaining a heightened awareness of risk. This lingering caution could be seen in the way food was handled. Even when supplies were sufficient, there might be a reluctance to use them freely. Meals might remain modest, not out of necessity in that moment, but out of a desire to preserve a buffer against the future. Hunger, once experienced, left an imprint that extended beyond the period in which it was most acute. At the same time, this caution was not always uniformly maintained. Different households responded in different ways, influenced by their experiences, resources, and expectations. Some might return more quickly to a sense of normality, while others retained a more guarded approach. These differences added another layer of variation to the already complex landscape of medieval life. Another subtle but important development was the way hunger influenced perceptions of value. Food, already central to survival, took on an even more pronounced significance. Its worth was not measured only in terms of quantity, but in reliability. A source of food that could be depended upon, even if modest, might be valued more highly than one that promised abundance but carried greater risk. This preference for reliability over potential abundance could shape decisions about land use, crop selection, and even social relationships. Stability, where it could be found, became a kind of quiet priority. In a world where uncertainty had grown more pronounced, the ability to predict, even within narrow limits, was a form of security. At the same time, the broader systems that connected different regions, trade routes, market networks, and flows of goods, continued to evolve. These systems had the potential to mitigate local shortages by bringing in food from elsewhere, but they also introduced new dependencies. A community that relied on external supply was, in a sense, tied to conditions beyond its immediate control. When those broader systems functioned well, they could provide relief. Grain might arrive from regions with better harvests, easing local scarcity. But when they faltered due to poor conditions elsewhere, disruptions in transport, or economic constraints, the reliance on them could become a vulnerability. Hunger, once again, was shaped by connections that extended beyond the immediate environment. This interplay between local conditions and wider networks is crucial to understanding how hunger evolved during this period. It was not simply a matter of isolated failures. It was a dynamic process, influenced by interactions at multiple levels, each affecting the others in ways that were not always predictable. Within this complexity, the experience of hunger retained its grounding in the body and the household. No matter how large the system became, no matter how far grain might travel, the ultimate question remained the same: what was available to eat, and in what quantity? And yet, The answers to that question were increasingly shaped by factors that extended far beyond the immediate control of those asking it. Weather patterns, population pressures, economic relationships, social structures, and emerging networks of exchange all played a role, creating a landscape in which hunger was both a local experience and part of a broader pattern. As these patterns continued to develop, they began to influence not only the present, but the direction of future change. The adjustments made in response to hunger, whether in labor, land use, or economic relationships, did not simply disappear when conditions improved. They became part of the evolving structure of medieval society. This gradual accumulation of change is easy to overlook because it does not always announce itself in dramatic moments. It unfolds through countless small decisions, each shaped by immediate need, each contributing in some way to a larger transformation. And it is within this accumulation, this layering of response upon response, that the next stage of the story begins to form, one in which the long-standing balance between people, land, and food is not only tested, but gradually reconfigured, setting the stage for developments that would carry the experience of hunger into new contexts and reshape how it was understood and endured in the generations that followed. As this reconfiguration unfolded, one of the most significant changes appeared. Not in a single decision, but in a gradual shift in how land itself was valued and organized. Under sustained pressure, land was no longer seen only as something to be worked according to inherited patterns. It became something to be reconsidered, adapted, and, in some cases, restructured in response to changing conditions. This did not mean a sudden transformation across all regions. Medieval society was not uniform, and responses varied widely. But there were places where the traditional balance between arable fields, pasture, and common resources began to shift. Land that had once been cultivated continuously might be allowed to rest more often, not as a deliberate improvement strategy in the modern sense, but as a practical response to reduced labor or declining yields. In other cases, areas that had been marginally productive were quietly abandoned, their use no longer justifying the effort required. These adjustments, though often small in isolation, could collectively alter the agricultural landscape. The pattern of fields, the distribution of crops, the balance between grain production and animal husbandry, all began to reflect not only inherited custom, but recent experience. Hunger, in this way, left its mark on the land itself. At the same time, the changing value of land influenced social relationships. Where land was scarce and population high, access to it had always been tightly controlled. But when conditions shifted, when some areas became less productive or when population pressures eased slightly through movement, the dynamics around land could begin to change. Opportunities, though limited, might open in unexpected ways. A household that had previously struggled to secure enough land might find, under altered conditions, a chance to expand its holdings, even if only modestly. Another might lose access, unable to maintain obligations or sustain productivity. These changes were not uniform or predictable, but they contributed to a gradual reshaping of rural society. And within this reshaping, the experience of hunger remained a constant reference point. Decisions about land were not abstract. They were tied directly to the question of whether that land could sustain those who depended on it. Productivity, reliability, and resilience became central concerns, even if they were not always expressed in those terms. Meanwhile, the organization of work continued to evolve alongside these changes. As the relationship between labor and land shifted, so too did the ways in which work was structured. In some cases, there was a move toward arrangements that allowed for greater flexibility, reflecting the need to adapt to uncertain conditions. In others, traditional obligations were maintained, but with increasing strain. This tension between continuity and adaptation is one of the defining features of the period. The system did not simply break and reform in a single moment. It stretched, adjusted, and, in some cases, reoriented itself gradually, influenced by countless local decisions and broader pressures. Within households, these shifts were experienced in deeply practical terms. The question of how to allocate effort between fieldwork, animal care, gathering, and other tasks became increasingly complex. Each choice carried implications not only for immediate survival, but for the household's longer-term position. For example, investing more time in tending animals might provide a more reliable source of food in certain conditions, but it could also reduce the time available for crop cultivation. Expanding cultivation might increase potential output, but at the cost of greater labor demands and exposure to risk. These were not theoretical calculations. They were daily realities, navigated without certainty. At the same time, knowledge itself began to take on a slightly different role. The accumulated experience of previous generations remained essential, but it was now applied in a context that was changing. Practices that had once been reliable might need adjustment. Observations of weather, soil, and crop behavior took on renewed importance, as people sought to understand patterns that no longer seemed entirely familiar. This process of observation and adjustment did not produce immediate solutions. It was incremental, shaped by trial, error, and necessity. But it reflects a key aspect of how medieval peasants responded to hunger, not through sudden innovation, but through continuous adaptation within the limits of their environment and resources. At the same time, broader economic developments continued to interact with these local changes. Markets, trade, and the movement of goods did not stand still. They evolved alongside the pressures affecting rural life. In some regions, increased integration into market systems offered new opportunities, allowing households to supplement their production through exchange. In others, it introduced new vulnerabilities, tying local survival more closely to external conditions. This dual nature of economic connection is important. It could both alleviate and intensify hunger, depending on circumstances. Access to markets could provide relief in times of local shortage, but it could also expose households to price fluctuations and competition that they could not control. As these dynamics unfolded, the experience of hunger became even more deeply embedded in the structure of everyday life. It was no longer only a response to environmental variation or local scarcity. It was part of a broader system of relationships between land and labor, between local and regional economies, between households and authorities. And yet, despite this growing complexity, the immediate experience remained grounded in familiar sensations. The weight of a loaf of bread, the thickness of a bowl of pottage, the strength or weakness felt at the end of a day's work. These were the measures by which people understood their condition. The larger forces at play were felt through these smaller, more tangible realities. It is this combination of scale that makes the story of medieval hunger so revealing. It connects the vast climate, population, economy with the intimate meals, bodies, households. Each level influences the other, creating a pattern that is both intricate and deeply human. And as this pattern continued to evolve, it began to influence not only how hunger was experienced, but how it was anticipated. The memory of recent hardship, combined with the awareness of ongoing change, encouraged a more cautious approach to the future. Planning, to the extent that it was possible, became more deliberate, more attentive to risk. This does not mean that uncertainty was eliminated. Far from it. But it does suggest a shift in how people engaged with that uncertainty. Hunger was no longer seen solely as an unavoidable feature of life. It was also something to be prepared for, managed, and, where possible, mitigated through a combination of knowledge, effort, and adaptation. And it is within this emerging mindset, this blend of caution, adaptation, and continued effort, that the next phase of the story begins to take shape, as the long-term consequences of these shifts start to become more visible, influencing not only individual lives and communities, but the broader direction of medieval society itself, setting in motion changes that would continue to unfold beyond the immediate horizon point. One of the more striking consequences of this gradual shift was the way expectations themselves began to adjust, not just in response to what people experienced, but in anticipation of what might come. Where once a good harvest could restore a sense of balance with relative confidence, now that confidence was often tempered. Even in favorable conditions, there was an awareness that stability might be temporary, that the system beneath the surface had changed in subtle but meaningful ways. This altered sense of expectation shaped how people responded to improvement. A year of abundance did not always lead to immediate relaxation of caution. Instead, it could prompt more deliberate efforts to rebuild reserves, to restore what had been lost, and to strengthen the household against future uncertainty. Grain might be stored more carefully, animals retained rather than consumed, and resources managed with an eye toward durability rather than immediate comfort. At the same time, this cautious approach could influence how surplus was distributed within communities. In earlier periods, relative abundance might have been shared more freely, reinforcing social bonds and mutual support. Under conditions shaped by recent scarcity, sharing still occurred, but it could be more measured, more contingent on the expectation of reciprocity or the preservation of essential reserves. This does not suggest a decline in social cohesion, but rather a shift in how it was expressed. Support networks remained important, but they operated within tighter constraints. The balance between generosity and self-preservation became more delicate, reflecting the pressures that hunger had imposed. Another development that began to take shape was the growing significance of timing, not just in agriculture, but in decision-making more broadly. When conditions were less predictable, the moment at which a choice was made could carry greater weight. Selling grain too early might mean losing access to it later at a higher price. Holding on to it too long could risk spoilage or the inability to meet immediate needs. The margin for error narrowed, and with it, the importance of judgment. This emphasis on timing extended to labor as well. Tasks had always been tied to seasonal rhythms, but under increased pressure, the precision of those tasks became more critical. Delays that might once have been absorbed could now have more pronounced consequences. The coordination of effort within households and across communities became a key factor in maintaining productivity. At the same time, the relationship between immediate survival and long-term sustainability continued to evolve. Decisions made in response to hunger often favored the present, as they had to, but over time, the cumulative effect of those decisions could reshape the conditions that future generations would inherit. Land that was overworked, resources that were depleted, and social arrangements that were strained all contributed to a landscape that was subtly different from what had existed before. This process of change was not uniform, and it did not move in a single direction. In some areas, conditions stabilized, allowing for a gradual recovery and even modest growth. In others, pressures remained more persistent, leading to continued adjustment and, at times, further strain. The experience of hunger, therefore, continued to vary across regions, shaped by local conditions and broader trends. Within this variability, however, there were common threads. The importance of resilience, the need for adaptability, the influence of uncertainty. These were shared elements that defined how medieval peasants navigated their world. Hunger, in its many forms, was both a challenge and a teacher, shaping behavior in ways that extended beyond the immediate problem it presented. It also began to influence how people understood their place within the larger system. The connection between individual effort and outcome, while still present, was increasingly recognized as being mediated by factors beyond direct control. Weather, markets, obligations, and broader social dynamics all played a role, complicating the relationship between work and reward. This recognition did not lead to a withdrawal from effort. On the contrary, it often reinforced the importance of persistence. But it did introduce a layer of complexity into how success and failure were perceived. A poor outcome was not always seen as a reflection of inadequate effort, just as a good outcome was not always attributed solely to diligence. At the same time, these evolving perceptions began to intersect with broader shifts in how medieval society was organized. Changes in labor patterns, in the use of land, and in economic relationships did not occur in isolation. They were part of a larger process in which the structures that had long governed rural life were being tested and, in some cases, gradually redefined. This did not happen through sudden transformation, but through a series of incremental adjustments. Agreements were modified, practices adapted, expectations recalibrated. Each change, taken alone, might seem minor. Together, they contributed to a gradual reshaping of the system. And throughout this process, hunger remained a constant reference point. It was both a measure of the system's effectiveness and a force that drove its evolution. When hunger was managed successfully, it reinforced existing practices. When it intensified, it prompted reconsideration and change. Perhaps one of the most revealing aspects of this period is how these changes were experienced at the level of the individual. For a peasant living through these conditions, the broader transformations might not have been visible as a coherent process. Instead, they would have been felt as a series of adjustments, new challenges, new decisions, new uncertainties layered onto familiar routines. The experience of hunger, therefore, was not static. It evolved alongside the system that produced it. It was shaped by changing conditions, by responses to those conditions, and by the cumulative effects of past experiences. It was both a constant presence and a shifting reality. And as these layers continued to build, they began to influence not only how people responded to hunger, but how they prepared for it. The idea of anticipating scarcity, of planning not just for the next season but for a less certain future, became more pronounced. This did not eliminate risk, but it altered how risk was approached. Households might diversify their activities where possible, balancing crop production with other forms of subsistence. Communities might strengthen certain practices that had proven effective in times of difficulty. Authorities might refine their approaches to managing supply and demand. Each of these actions reflected an attempt, however limited, to bring some degree of control to a situation that often resisted it. And yet, despite these efforts, the underlying tension remained. The system had adapted, but it had not become immune to the forces that shaped it. Hunger continued to emerge, sometimes in familiar ways, sometimes in new forms, always connected to the broader context in which people lived. It is within this ongoing tension, between adaptation and vulnerability, between continuity and change, that the next chapter begins to unfold, as the cumulative effects of these developments start to intersect with even larger shifts in medieval society, drawing the experience of hunger into a wider transformation that would continue to shape lives in ways both expected and unforeseen. One of the clearest ways this intersection revealed itself was through the gradual rebalancing of dependency. For much of the medieval period, peasant households had relied heavily on a combination of their own production and the surrounding local structures, custom, obligation, and community, to sustain them. But as pressures accumulated, that balance began to tilt, not entirely away from local reliance, but toward a more complex mix of self-sufficiency and external dependence. In practical terms, this meant that even households deeply rooted in the land began, where possible, to engage more deliberately with opportunities beyond it. Seasonal work, small-scale trade, and the exchange of labor or goods became more significant. These were not entirely new practices, but they took on greater importance as traditional forms of stability proved less reliable under changing conditions. This shift carried a quiet but important implication. Survival was no longer anchored solely in the field. It extended outward into relationships, into markets, into networks that could provide alternatives when local production faltered. Hunger, therefore, was no longer just a failure of harvest. It was also a question of access to work, to exchange, to movement. And yet, access itself was uneven. Not all households were equally positioned to take advantage of these emerging possibilities. Those with slightly more resources, better connections, or greater flexibility could navigate this expanded landscape more effectively. Others remained more tightly bound to the limits of their immediate environment, experiencing hunger in more direct and constrained ways. This divergence, though gradual, began to shape the internal structure of rural communities. Differences that had once been modest could become more pronounced over time. Some households might find ways to stabilize their position, even modestly improve it, while others struggled to recover from repeated periods of scarcity. At the same time, this growing differentiation did not erase the shared experience of vulnerability. Even those who managed to secure a more stable footing remained aware of how easily conditions could change. The memory of hunger was not easily set aside. It informed decisions, tempered expectations, and reinforced a sense of caution that extended across social boundaries. Another layer of this transformation emerged in the relationship between effort and reward. As the system became more complex, the direct link between labor and outcome, never perfectly predictable, became even less so. A household could work diligently and still face poor results due to factors beyond its control. Conversely, opportunities outside traditional agriculture might offer returns that were not strictly tied to the same cycle of risk. This did not diminish the importance of agricultural labor. Fields still needed to be worked, and most households remained deeply dependent on what they could produce. But it introduced a subtle shift in how effort was valued and allocated. Where alternatives existed, even in limited form, they could influence how people balanced their time and energy. Within this shifting landscape, the experience of hunger continued to act as both a constraint and a catalyst. It limited choices by narrowing resources, but it also prompted exploration of those choices that remained. It encouraged households to consider not only how to endure, but how to position themselves in a way that might reduce future risk. This process was rarely deliberate in a strategic sense. It was shaped by immediate necessity, by available options, and by the lessons of recent experience. But over time, it contributed to a gradual reconfiguration of how rural life was organized. At the same time, the broader systems that connected different regions, trade, governance, and emerging economic relationships, continued to evolve. These systems could amplify local conditions, for better or worse. A region experiencing scarcity might be supported by imports, but it might also find itself competing with other regions facing similar challenges. Hunger, once again, was not confined to a single place. It was part of a larger network of interdependence. This interdependence introduced new forms of uncertainty. A household might manage its own production carefully, only to find that external factors, price changes, shifts in supply, disruptions in movement, altered the availability of food. The sphere of influence over survival expanded, but so did the range of variables that could not be controlled. And yet, within this expanding sphere, there remained a consistent thread: the centrality of daily life. The preparation of meals, the management of stores, the allocation of effort. These remained the points at which broader forces were translated into lived experience. Hunger was not experienced as an abstract condition. It was felt in the body, in the rhythm of work, in the quiet adjustments made at the hearth. It is here that the continuity of medieval life becomes most apparent. Despite the shifts unfolding at larger scales, the essential routines persisted. People rose, worked, ate, rested, and planned as they always had, even as the context of those actions changed. This continuity provided a kind of stability, a framework within which adaptation could occur. But continuity did not mean stasis. Within those routines, the meaning of actions evolved. A meal that might once have been taken for granted could now be approached with a heightened awareness of its significance. A successful harvest, even a modest one, could carry a deeper sense of relief. The absence of hunger, however temporary, became something to be noticed. This heightened awareness extended to the future. Planning, to the extent it was possible, became more attentive to uncertainty. Households considered not only what they needed for the present, but what might be required if conditions shifted again. This did not eliminate risk, but it reflected a growing recognition of its persistence. And as this recognition deepened, it began to influence not only individual behavior, but the broader patterns of society. The adjustments made in response to hunger, whether in labor, land use, or economic engagement, did not simply address immediate needs. They contributed to longer-term changes in how medieval communities functioned. These changes, though gradual, set the stage for further developments. The relationship between people and land, between local and regional systems, between tradition and adaptation, continued to evolve. Hunger remained at the center of this process, both as a challenge to be managed and as a force shaping the direction of change. And it is at this point, as these evolving patterns begin to intersect more visibly with larger transformations in population, economy, and social structure, that the next phase begins to take form, one in which the experience of hunger would be drawn into even wider currents of change, carrying with it the accumulated weight of past hardship and the uncertain promise of what might follow.